Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. I'm Brandon Jaffe. Join us as we explore relationship and mental health issues by weeding out the trends in the mental health industry to uncover what truly works in improving our emotional well-being and relationships. At Inspired Resolutions Counseling, we specialize in providing interventions and resources for families with teens, focusing on topics such as teen mental health, parenting challenges, and family dynamics. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the myth of bottling things up. And I know this is going to, quote unquote, trigger a lot of people. We love this term, don't bottle things up. You got to get it out. And I think every therapist, every parent, every life coach guru uses this term of bottling things up. I have used this term. I've noticed, however, in my practice that when you look at it that way, it can be a mindset that actually gets in the way of finding resolution and addressing what's really going on. Bottling your feelings up or you'll explode. I'm going out on a limb and I'm just going to say that this concept does not fit with how human emotions actually work. Let's start with this simple truth and analogy that a lot of people have used. My point is the analogy isn't true. People like to say that emotions build up like a pressure cooker, so to speak. The truth is emotions don't build up inside of us like steam in a pressure cooker. We're not dams that overflow when too many emotions accumulate. The human emotional experience is more complex and in some ways more simple than that. I know that's kind of a contradictory way to say it. What really happens when we feel overwhelmed or resentful is that we have not addressed unhealthy patterns in relationship. We have conflicts that have not been resolved, or they've been resolved in a way that we feel powerless. And we usually have either a pattern of, like I said, not being in control or not being assertive in a healthy way and not having set boundaries in a healthy way in certain relationships that we have. And sometimes it's not our fault, especially when you're young. When you're a young child, you only have so much that you control in your life. I want to start by saying communication is key. Think about it. How often do we look back at our past behaviors or hurts from someone in our lives and then allow our version of those stories and patterns, that what we remember, we allow those to shape our current feelings? It's easy to blame, oh, I've bottled it up. In reality, number one, you might not have forced yourself to take and see the perspective from other points of view. Most likely you haven't set clear boundaries. Most likely you haven't communicated, hey, here's an issue, and tried to talk about what your limits, what your needs are. Resentment is usually built because once you're older, it's because you haven't set boundaries. You've made choices to take on roles in relationships that are unhealthy for you. Or you have an unhealthy perspective on your role or what you're experiencing in a relationship. There's this concept that I have heard from the time I was trained as a therapist. And it's not said this way, but the idea is that you have to air every single feeling and thought that you have out. Otherwise, you're going to be emotionally unhealthy. In other words, to be healthy, you've got to say it all. And I get parents saying that all the time. I'll have parents seek out therapy for their child because their child has experienced something, some sort of an adversity. And it can be a significant problem, maybe even a trauma. And the immediate thought is, right now, because this thing just happened, I need to get my child the kind of help where they will talk out loud. We live in a time where we're constantly told that in order to be okay, we have to let our feelings out. Basically all of them, all the time. And that's causing all sorts of problems in the world today. And expressing emotions is important. But it's not the only path to emotional well-being for everybody. There are some people like me who process out loud, and there are some people who need to sit in silence. And in fact, constant emotional expression can be really counterproductive, especially for people who either don't process well verbally, or some people who are good at processing verbally but become obsessed with certain negative aspects of their life and they fail to see the big picture. Everybody processes differently. Some are external processors like me. We make sense of things in a healthy way. You process things out loud, and as you hear your own thoughts, you can wrap your head around it. For me, I sometimes feel bad for people who are in front of me because I'll say things and then I'll immediately change it up because I'm wrapping my head around it. I hear it. Now I can kind of visualize it. And then I'm shifting my concept of what I'm experiencing or what I'm doing or what I'm thinking about. Others need to sit in silence. They don't need you talking to them, and they don't need to go to a therapist. They need to sit. And both types of processors can and often do get to a healthy place in terms of resolution in their life and relationships. This is so important when it comes to parenting. Like I said before, there are so many parents pushing their kids to express what they're feeling and thinking immediately after some sort of an incident. And then they say that you can't bottle things up. They give the message that if you want to sit in silence, you are bad or wrong or not healthy. And that's just not the truth. Forcing a child or anyone to talk before they're ready can do harm. Some teens I've worked with end up feeling worse because they were forced into a pressure situation where they thought they had to seek out therapy. And I tell parents often, look, I know that you are desperate right now to get resolution and for your child to feel better, but if they aren't ready, it can be counterproductive. And it's a hard concept for the average parent to wrap their mind around because parents don't want to wait to take care of things in their child's life. Silence is often okay. What's the takeaway here? Instead of focusing on the idea of bottling things up, we should be thinking in terms of healthy processing versus avoidance. We don't want people to avoid. Ask yourself, are you sitting with your thoughts because you need time to process, or are you avoiding addressing a difficult issue? There's a big difference. And a lot of times if you're avoiding things because of shame or embarrassment. So it's important for each individual to find that distinction between, am I avoiding or am I being patient and waiting to process? Healthy processing isn't always done out loud. A lot of times people will need to write. They will need to sit, and some people need to exercise. They need to get moving around and get distracted to process things. It's important that you figure out what works so that you're not avoiding, and what works so that you are kind of pushing yourself in a healthy way, but pushing yourself nonetheless. When I think about the whole bottling up concept and how we've been treating it as therapists and the fact that we overuse it, I think about a particular client of mine. This was years and years ago, and they were referred to me because of pretty major tragedy in their lives. And I was a young therapist, and I wasn't licensed yet. And I can remember having the intake. And I was told by the person who gave me this intake that it was such a big deal. I really needed to get them in. They were in a really bad place. And so I met with the parents first, and then I met with the teen. And meeting with the parents, I kind of got roped in. Man, yeah, this thing that had happened to this teen, it had to do with an assault type situation. The teen was harmed in pretty bad ways. I remember talking to the parents, and they were desperate to get their child help. And my supervisor was very adamant about getting this child help. I got kind of roped in, and man, my heart's going out to this family. The parents were absolutely desperate. They were almost insistent about their child coming in more than once a week. They were willing to do anything and everything in order to afford the therapy that their child wanted. And so then I met with a child, and this teen at first did not want to talk during the intake, which is, I mean, that happens. That happens a lot. My assumption, of course, back then was, oh, this teen is being resistant to getting the help that they need. This is a part of their trauma response. And and all these other assumptions that I had been taught and that supervisors and professors had kind of poured into me. And at one point in going through this intake process, the teen basically just said, I am not going to see you. And being so young as a therapist, I remember just, oh man, what did I do? How's my supervisor going to see this? This is bad. So I had to fight every instinct to try to talk this teen into doing therapy because I knew that wasn't what you do. And again, I was stuck on the fact that things will bottle up if this teen doesn't get therapy and help right now because the incident was so bad. As I talked to the teen and I said, okay, you're not willing to come. I said the standard, I will be here when you're ready. And I can't remember exactly how it went down, but the teen basically said, I'm not going to be ready. And the teen proceeded to list off the support and help that they had in their life and told me about ways that they were processing this terrible thing that had happened to them. And they even told me some of the conclusions that they had come to, some ways that they were going to protect themselves and plans for the future. As I was listening to where this teen was already at, it dawned on me that the teen was actually far healthier in response to this incident than the parents. And at the time, I was such a young therapist, and I went with it. I had them all come back in, and at the end of the intake, I told them my recommendation. I said, your child is not willing to get help, but you guys are hurting. You guys are struggling. You're not coping, and they were not going to work, and the marriage was getting difficult. And I said, so I would like to work with you because right now, your child isn't willing to do therapy and your child seems to be functioning. And if that stops, I think that we should revisit it. And they were very hesitant and they weren't sure that they were going to take my recommendation. I had to tell my supervisor what I had said and that I didn't make the recommendation to see this teen. And I can remember because as a therapist, you have to go into group supervision. So I was bringing this case into group supervision and I got blasted by the group. The other associates could not believe that I didn't insist on seeing this teen. And my supervisor was kind of interesting because she devil's advocated both sides. But at the end, this supervisor put it in my hands and was respecting my recommendation. And of course, after this group, I'm going, oh man, I don't know. I really just, I was unsure of myself after this group supervision. And the way that the group was run, she let everybody just kind of have their opinion. And so I was sitting with my colleagues telling me that I had made a mistake and wasn't really sure where my supervisor's opinion lied. And so I just went with it. And I worked with this family for several years. At some point, I was very glad I had made and went forward with my recommendation, and so were they, because this tragedy or this trauma, this incident in this child's life brought up a lot of family issues that were going on that never would have gotten brought up in marital issues. And so really the right call was to address the family from the top down, meaning through the parents and their relationship. And it was interesting because while the incident came up often, it came up in therapy in regards to how the parents were being affected and kind of helping them healthfully navigate with just a healthy amount of pressure, not an unhealthy amount of pressure towards their child. Watching that unfold was an important shift of many shifts and an important foundation building in terms of the therapy that I do with families who have teens who are struggling. At some point, I heard that the teen had ended up seeking help, and this was a couple years later, seeking help from a therapist, and they had actually wanted me to see their child, and I said that I wouldn't because I was doing the family work. What had happened, though, was because occasionally the child would join the family work that we were doing, and so what was communicated to me a couple of years later by both the parents and I believe the teen. Basically, I was left with the impression that this teen was willing to get help for something else in their life because they had a positive regard towards therapy. Number one, because they weren't pushed into therapy when they didn't want it. And quite frankly, even though what had happened to them was terrible, they had many outlets and many ways to get healthy from this incident. And then number two, because they experienced their parents getting healthier in their roles in the family through therapy. If I had stuck with, oh, we can't let this child bottle things up, it would have been counterproductive both to the family and the child. I can think of so many times, both professionally and personally, where this concept of bottling up gets people in trouble because it's the wrong mindset to have in order to address the real things that might be going on, such as avoiding difficult realities in your life and avoiding doing the work, which is really important, not having healthy boundaries like I talked about earlier. I challenge everybody to stay away from this concept, this idea that we've got to not bottle things up. And I think about anger management. I teach anger management. I have an online course and I run a group. And when my anger management clients look at things as I just can't bottle things up, it doesn't help them resolve the patterns of unhealthy habits that they have. And one of the most important skills for somebody who struggles with anger, their anger response, is to be able to cope when they can't vent. You cannot vent all the time. It's not healthy to vent all the time. And somebody with a true anger management problem, once they start venting, they almost become addicted to it, and then they become overly negative and almost obsessed with always having to vent instead of learning to soothe themselves. And so I'm not saying that you shouldn't process and vent and say things out loud sometimes, but what I'm saying is that the myth of bottling things up brings us to a place where we ignore other ways to process and get healthy, and then can lead to a place where you become obsessed with processing things out loud without it being productive. Just because you get it out doesn't mean that you are being productive with it. I hope that this was helpful. I hope it didn't make too many people angry. And I hope that this might help you deal in your relationships and with your own difficult things going on in your life in a healthier way.
The Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast is an Inspired Resolutions production. Hosted by Brandon Jaffe. Edited and mixed by Natalie Atkinson. Music by Natalie and Sean Atkinson. Inspired Resolutions Counseling is based in Yorba Linda, California. Whether you're interested in joining our group, seeking therapy services, or exploring more of our resources, you can find us on our website, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Inspired Resolutions Counseling.